Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen. Now, you have a panel for us today.
Yes, my lord. So this afternoon we have a panel of 4 people representing organisations who will speak on the subject of fuel and COVID-19. Those 4 people are Mr. Matthew Cole, Ms. Rosalind Kane, both representing the Fuel Bank Foundation, Ms. Suzanne White of Queen's Cross Housing Association, and Mr. Paul Clark of Citrus Energy.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to you all.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Right. When you're ready, Mr. Stephen, off you go.
Thank you, my lord. Just a gentle reminder at the outset that the hearing is being transcribed, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly and not over one another, and I'm sure you're too polite to do that, but just a gentle reminder at the outset. Thank you. Can I start then by asking each of you in turn to confirm your full name, your role, both now and during the pandemic, and to give a short description of the organisation that you represent, the size of its membership and the work that it does. If I could start with you, please, Mr. Clark, and then we'll work our way along the line. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Stephen. My name's Paul Clark. I'm the head of operations of a social enterprise called Citrus Energy. We have been operating since 2012. One of our services is called Lemonade, and it helps people out of fuel poverty. So we've worked with over 60,000 people to help with our fuel poverty situation since 2013, basically. And obviously, I've always been head of operations from day one until now.
Thank you. Ms. White.
My name is Suzanne White, and I am the Financial Wellbeing Manager for Queen's Cross Housing Association. We have a team of welfare rights advisors and an energy advisor, and we provide advice and support to residents of Queen's Cross area. Is that everything?
As much as you would like to say at this point. Thank you. Ms. Kane.
My name is Rosalind Kane. I am Head of Foundation and Governance for the Fuel Bank Foundation. I've been with the organisation since its outset in 2016, and we provide fuel crisis support to people who are at risk of or already disconnected from their electricity or gas supply because they use prepayment meters.
Thank you. And Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen. So my name is Matthew Cole. During the COVID pandemic, I was chair of the trustees of the Fuel Bank Foundation. Post the pandemic, I'm the CEO of the organisation, and Ros describes the organisation really well. We are a food bank, but for electricity and gas, hence the name Fuel Bank.
Thank you very much, all of you. In terms of documentation that's been given to the inquiry in advance of the session today and disclosed to core participants, the Fuel Bank Foundation has provided a written response to a Rule 8 request that was made by the inquiry, and the reference for that is SCI-FBF XXX-5 zeros and a 3, and witness statements have also been provided by Mr. Clark, and the reference for that is SCI-WT 0369-5 zeros and a 1, a statement from Ms. White, reference for that being SCI-WT 0447-5 zeros and a 1, and finally a statement also from Ms. Kane, the reference for that being SCI-WT 0228-5 zeros and a 1. Now, we have limited time today, but please rest assured that everything that's contained in all of that documentation and anything else that you've provided to the inquiry will be taken into account. Now, with those matters out of the way, the intention today, as I think you all know, is to hear about some of the key issues and impacts that were experienced by both individuals and groups supported by your organisations, but also your own organisations and staff during the pandemic. And time permitting, the aim today will be to discuss 5 sort of themes or headings. Firstly, by way of introduction, I'd like to start with just exploring a bit about what's meant by the terms fuel poverty and fuel crisis and their prevalence in Scotland prior to the pandemic. Secondly, the key issues and impacts experienced by individuals and groups supported by your organisations during the pandemic. Thirdly, key issues and impacts experienced by your own organisations and staff during the pandemic. Fourthly, the issue of funding both during the pandemic and then any ongoing issues or impacts that you wish to highlight to the inquiry on the funding landscape now. And then fifth and finally, potential lessons to be learned. And I'd like to give each of you that opportunity to make suggestions for what you feel the Scottish Government could reasonably do either to mitigate ongoing impacts of the response to the pandemic, or could do differently or improve matters in the event of another pandemic or similar crisis. So that's the roadmap or plan for this afternoon. If I could start then with these terms of fuel poverty and fuel crisis, which some of you have mentioned in the introduction, I'd like to start by asking the panel what those terms mean and the extent to which they were issues prior to the pandemic. And if I could ask Mr. Cole, please, to start, and then we can work our way along the line in the other direction. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stephen. So, fuel poverty is defined for each country of the UK. There's a subtly different definition, but within Scotland, fuel poverty is defined by statute where people are spending more than 10% of their household income after housing costs on essential energy at home. There's a separate definition which just applies in Scotland of extreme fuel poverty, where people are spending more than 20% of their household income, and it's a really useful way to track how people are managing or how communities are managing generally. And prior to the pandemic, around 20% of people in Scotland were in fuel poverty. About a third of those were in extreme fuel poverty. Fuel crisis is a definition that the Fuel Bank Foundation developed about a decade or so ago, no, 8 years ago, sorry. And we see fuel crisis as a subset of fuel poverty. So being in fuel poverty means that money can be tight and it can be a struggle to keep the home to a sensible or optimal level of heat. Where fuel crisis is more immediate, fuel crisis is that sense of not having the money you need today to keep your house warm today, and so without support your house might fall cold very quickly. And we think that is something which is unique for those people who prepay for their energy, because if you have a prepayment meter where you have to buy your energy as you go, if you don't have the money you need to top up your prepayment meter today, we would say you're in fuel crisis, because without support your house will fall cold very quickly. So we think fuel crisis typically is something which only really exists for those people who have a prepayment meter and therefore pay as they go for their energy.
Thank you. Earlier in your answer, I think you mentioned about, I think it was fuel poverty being defined in legislation. That's legislation passed by the Scottish Government, is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Correct.
And there's a different definition of fuel poverty in each of the countries of the UK that passed by the UK government or governments in Wales and in Northern Ireland too.
Thank you. And to be clear, I think the Act that you may be mentioning is the Fuel Poverty, open brackets, Targets, Definition and Strategy, close brackets, Scotland Act 2019.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I ask a follow-up question, Mr. Cole, please, on what you consider, or the Fuel Bank Foundation considers to be the main drivers or reasons behind fuel poverty? And we'll obviously come on to the impact of the pandemic, but just generally speaking, what would be your view on what those main drivers are?
So there are 4 recognised drivers of fuel poverty in Scotland, but I think for the Fuel Bank Foundation, the key 3 ones are firstly the energy efficiency or thermal efficiency of a home. Living in a poor quality home means that you can waste money very easily trying to heat a home where heat leaks out of the doors and windows. Energy pricing is a real driver of fuel poverty. Now, energy pricing increased significantly after the pandemic, but even during the COVID period, the cost of energy itself, set by regulated suppliers, was a factor which resulted in people being in fuel poverty. And the third driver of fuel poverty is household income. If people are on a lower income, they're more likely to find themselves in fuel poverty. All of those 3 issues kind of were drivers of fuel poverty. During the pandemic period in particular, it was a mix of income and energy efficiency properties which were the key drivers.
Thank you. We'll come back to the pandemic in a moment, but Ms. Kane, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yes, I think I would add that you can have a really well insulated home and still be in fuel crisis, because obviously a poorly insulated home will drive energy costs higher, but the key factor about fuel crisis is the lack of money, and because you have to prepay through a prepayment meter, if you haven't got the money, you will disconnect, and that can happen as easily with a well-insulated home as with a poorly insulated home. So there is a link, but they're completely separate driving criteria.
Now, both you and Mr. Cole have mentioned the prepayment of energy. Could you elaborate on what the reason or reasons might be as to why somebody would prepay for their energy, for those who might be unfamiliar with the concept or what it means?
Certainly. Prepayment has always been a means of paying for energy. It used to be you'd put money in the meter. One of the primary drivers is people are used to prepaying. They've always prepaid. It's comfortable because they feel they have an element of control on what they're using, because the very factor of having to keep topping up the meter gives a greater understanding of how much they're spending. So it allows that element of control. Becomes more important as funding becomes tighter, obviously. The second factor is that very often in rented accommodation, it's a requirement of the landlord that a prepayment meter is installed, because otherwise when a tenant leaves there's a risk that the landlord gets left with unpaid energy bills. And then probably the other key driver is that it is a means of, for energy companies, it can be a means of managing credit risk. So if somebody is seen to be not of good risk, they may require, as a condition of being on supply, that they have a prepayment meter. Or it can be installed because they have been on credit, haven't paid for the energy that they've used. So a prepayment meter is a means of recovering unpaid costs without disconnecting the supply. So they continue to remain on supply and will agree a payment arrangement that's collected gradually each week through topping up the meter.
Thank you. Ms. White, is there anything you wish to add on these concepts pre-pandemic, please?
Not really, other than social housing, because of the it's rented properties for people on the lower incomes, it's disproportionately affected by those in both fuel poverty and people with prepayment meters. So that affects our residents as a higher proportion of the population.
Thank you. And then the inquiry is obviously very interested at this stage in both impacts, but also disproportionate impacts. So, it's useful to hear. And finally, Mr. Clark, on this kind of introductory segment, if you like, is there anything that you would wish to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the biggest issue during pandemic and then after the pandemic has been the fact that people have been more often in their own home, using more energy. So the issue we have seen is with an increase in prepayment metering and also smart metering, potentially initially installed in what you would call dry meter mode, so normal meter mode, but without the requirement for a warrant, suppliers being able to get to pay-as-you-go mode in smart metering. That's exacerbated the issue. So with people spending more time using more energy in their homes during the pandemic and having smart meters installed during that period of time, we've seen a huge increase in self-disconnection, which I believe we'll go on to.
Yes, we're going to come on to the pandemic.
That off the back of the pandemic and then from there, because there's been an increase in pay-as-you-go type metering, which includes smart metering, that's made the problem much, much worse.
All right. I want to move on then to the second of the themes or headings that I outlined at the start, and that's the key impacts on the individuals and groups that were supported by your organisations during the pandemic. And I'd like to ask the panel about the overall effect that the COVID-19 pandemic had on these, as we've just discussed, existing problems of fuel poverty and fuel crisis. And I'd like to ask you to highlight any key impacts on those whom you support, and that could include, for example, access to fuel or the ability to top up energy, digital inclusion, social isolation or mental health, energy debt enforcement, education, medical needs, the availability of pandemic information, and the extent to which the pandemic worsened any existing inequalities and indeed any other key issues that you wish to raise. On this theme, I'd like to start with Ms. Kane, please, if I can, and then we can work down to Ms. White, Mr. Clark, and then back to Mr. Cole. But please, all of you, feel free to build on anything that others on the panel mention and any matters that you think are key and pertinent to this. So if I could start with you, Ms. Kane, please.
Okay. I would think the starting point for the impact from the pandemic was that people were at home all the time. So that will automatically increase energy costs. And as winter draws on, it will increase them further, because obviously if you're at home all day, even without the impact of cold weather, you cooking, kettle, television, computers, whatever, you're using energy by being at home, hot water to wash hands, so on. So it will start off with an ever-increasing amount of energy because people are at home. Obviously, there was a significant shift to working from home, which then meant people had to have access to energy for internet, computers and so on. Children educating at home, same thing. So there was a real increase in need for and usage of energy during that time to do the basic things that required. Obviously, that drove energy costs at a point when people potentially were on lower, reduced incomes, being furloughed, not being able to find, people are picking up casual work to make ends meet. It was no longer there. Getting help required access to the internet because you couldn't walk into a community hub or an organisation. You had to do everything online or by the phone. So everything required access to energy for access to the internet, which drove costs very, very significantly at a time when at best income was remained static, but for a lot of people it decreased. So it was more cost with less opportunity to pay for it. And of course the impact of that also is the access to the outside world was through online means. If you were having to ration your usage because you just hadn't got the funding for it, there was the whole social isolation impact. Keeping up touch with family is absolutely core. For young people, keeping in touch with their friends and having that social interaction and friendship, maintaining friendships, understand what's going on. Everybody's way of life shifted with the additional pressure for many who were struggling, in that knowing that you had to work out exactly what you do in order to be able to afford the energy to do the essentials. So it became a vicious circle. I think it's fair to say for people who were financially struggling, it was very, very difficult to access help. And if you lost energy, then the means of access help disappeared until you could next top up, in effect. So it really had a very fundamental shift on people's ability to participate in both work, schooling and the normal interactions of life. Then if you had a critical dependency of energy, so the most obvious example people will quote is if you're diabetic and need to keep insulin in the fridge, the risk of losing power and the fridge going off was a risk to that medicines would go off. People who need electronic devices, sleep apnea machines, for example, dependent on energy in the home. Mobility scooters, dependent on energy to recharge. Stair lifts, completely dependent on energy. And just think of the example of a stair lift. You're halfway up the stairs when the power goes off. What do you do? So there's a whole load of hidden things that are known to individuals in households that are not widely known, but if you're on a prepayment meter struggling to top up, there's a real risk to people's health and well-being from the whole accumulation of the impacts of the COVID crisis and the ability to be able to afford to top up your meter.
I think the way you put it, paragraph 20 of your witness statement, is that it had a diminishing impact on people's quality of life, I think is the way that you put it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Miss White, could I move on to you, please?
Mm-hmm. I think you've covered so much there, haven't you? Specifically, I suppose for our tenants, we're based in the city centre of Glasgow, and we have multi-stories, high-rise blocks. So as the higher proportion of properties are smaller flats. So the number of people maybe at home increased the cost. children not at school, so they were often using maybe one device or two devices between them, but it increased the cost for them to use these devices at home. The lack of ability for some people to get out to actually purchase prepayment meters, so even if they had the money, it wasn't always straightforward to get out and purchase those, because you usually go to a shop to top up if you can't do it online. So the lack of ability for support networks where friends and family would have maybe done that in the past. Residents who previously were working and they were either lost their job or were furloughed and maybe didn't get the 20% top up, so they might have been paid 80% of their salaries. But also a number of our residents are on 0 hours contracts, so their work is dependent on them being able to do the hours available, so they didn't have that ability either. So they might not have lost their job in the same way, they just had less hours potentially. Residents who were working but had childcare, so they were putting their children into nursery, for example, or school, and that all stopped, so they then had to either give up work or reduce their working hours to manage between them. So for some families who were maybe both working full-time, they would have potentially lost one salary and maybe didn't qualify or qualified minimally for universal credit. There's a huge number of people across the country who applied for benefits for the first time ever, so they went from working and managing their household bills to suddenly being in receipt of minimum income of benefits, which is a very low amount of money when you're trying to manage your household. Actually, those in receipt of benefits previously who continued to be in receipt of benefits, so didn't have the same shock of reduction in income, they just stayed static. So although their costs might have increased, their actual income remained static, so they weren't so dramatically impacted at the beginning. But obviously over the periods, well, it went on longer, the costs increased for them as well. So there was a huge impact on household income, well-being for those specifically living in properties where their children couldn't go into gardens, they couldn't get out and about. They were very stuck inside, and it was a real struggle on their mental health and well-being. I think I've crossed into another section, but
No, not at all. Thank you very much. Mr. Clark, anything you'd like to add on this?
Again, lots and lots of areas covered there. I suppose to segue in relation to an increase in people with mental health issues, left isolated, left in cold, damp homes, depressing already, without the fact that they are maybe vulnerable individuals, and for them to try and seek support that wasn't available because of the pandemic, basically, so it made the problem much, much worse. We had to train staff on how to deal with, people who were approaching who had mental health issues, people who were approaching us and suggesting that they were close to suicide, etc. That extreme, we were having to train our staff on how to deal with that. Lots and lots of people who already were vulnerable and had medical conditions, their medical condition was exacerbated by the fact that they couldn't have their heating on all of the time. So people with respiratory conditions, people who relied on heat, but because it wasn't there, their medical condition was worse. Or if they had COVID, they had COVID and then they were living, in a cold, damp home at the same time. So there was much, much more demand from vulnerable groups for help and support, and that's continued because of what's happened in relation to the energy market. Because obviously, from our opinion, the opportunity for energy suppliers to suggest there was a reduction in demand for their services, therefore they had to increase prices. That came at the same time, as an increase in demand for consumers for energy. So yeah, echo everything else that's been said.
Thank you. And you also talk in your statement, Mr. Clark, I think, about commercial and charity energy users as well. At paragraph 22, I think you talk about what you call volume tolerance penalties.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate on what that issue was during the pandemic for those users?
It takes it slightly to the side, but the part of what we do as a social enterprise is also work with charities, social enterprises and businesses. And obviously during the pandemic and then into the energy crisis, where there was a price cap for domestic energy consumers, there wasn't that for businesses. So businesses who hadn't budgeted for it were all of a sudden paying 5, 6 and 7 times more for their energy costs. So what that meant is the knock-on effect is they couldn't provide their services. They had to make potentially staff redundant, had to go out of business altogether. In relation to volume tolerance, what that relates to for a business is businesses procure their energy contracts usually minimum 12 months. So that's the kind of main difference between a domestic energy contract. You can still get fixed terms for domestic contracts, but businesses have always been in a situation where they have to, take a 12, 24 or 36 month contract. But to procure a new energy contract, what the new suppliers will look at is the energy you've consumed already as a business. So when lots of businesses were not in their premises, for them to then procure new contracts after the pandemic, that, what energy might that business use over the next 12 months usually is based on what they've used in the last 12 months, but in the last 12 months they weren't in. So there's a thing called volume tolerance where suppliers then had the opportunity, even with energy prices being huge for businesses, they still had the opportunity, if that business used more than 80% of the energy they had said they were going to consume, they can charge them more money. Sorry, if 20% over, or less than 80%, they can charge them more money. So that had a knock-on effect for commercial businesses as well, in that they just couldn't afford to sustain their services, and lots of them went out of business because of that. And the knock-on effect is the consumer then has not got a job.
Thank you. And something else I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Clark, was also energy debt enforcement. I think this is something that both you and Ms. White talk about in your statements, but you mentioned it, Mr. Clark, at paragraph 18. Could you just explain what the approach was to that energy debt enforcement during the pandemic and what the effect of that, I suppose, has been for the people that you support?
Again, for me, energy suppliers, they've not really been very caring towards energy debt or an increase in energy debt, both for business and for energy consumers. And during the energy crisis as well, standing charges have increased. So whereas lots of people have self-disconnected, therefore, the debt is so high that they can't afford to top up their meter. Because every time they top up their meter, potentially 75% of every top-up pays the previous debt, or the underlying debt that's still there. So we've seen, many situations where they self-disconnect, but while they're self-disconnected, because there's been a massive increase in standing charges, that continues to accrue and continues to add to that energy debt. So suppliers now, the debt levels are massive. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Scotland it's going to touch something like 4 billion in energy debt, for consumers and commercial energy users as well. So there's no, any solutions, any funds that are available is money that normally pays towards the supplier. So it helps the supplier out. But the consumer is kind of still left with a situation where standing charges continue to accrue, even though they're not using energy. So the debt situation it's gone beyond the pale, frankly. And it's now, for lots of people, the norm. It's not seen as a big issue because they just can't get rid of the energy debt, and energy prices have continued to double, treble, So there's no way of them eating into that energy debt.
Thank you. Now, I want to give Mr. Cole an opportunity on this theme, but just before I do, you used that word, I think, self-disconnect. Could I just ask you to describe briefly what you mean by that when people self-disconnect, just so we're clear?
For me, ostensibly, it's when they just can't afford to use their energy. It's as simple as that. They can't afford, so they go without.
Thank you.
We get, Citrus being attached to Housing Association, we work with lots of social landlords, and we get lots of people, landlords reporting to us when they go and do their annual gas safety check, but the gas has already been capped. So what that basically means is they can't use their gas. And then the consumer can't afford for it to be uncapped. But the landlord is saying, you have to. It's a breach of your tenancy conditions if you don't uncap your gas, if you don't continue to try and heat your home. So self-disconnections for Citrus, for Lemonade, over the last 3 years, we used to average about 250 self-disconnections that we helped a year. So we helped these people remove the debt issue and get back on supply. Yeah, it's gone from 250 on average now to about 3,500 per annum of self-disconnections. That's because there's been an increase in pay-as-you-go type metering. So it's easy for suppliers now to use it as debt control.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes, and then I'll need to give Mr. Cole an opportunity to come in. Yeah.
So just to clarify the self-disconnection, and I think you've said, but when somebody's in debt and they decide not to use their gas anymore, they stop using it, the debt will sit there until either we do an annual service, so we have to either have credit to do the service, or we have to cap the gas so they don't have access to it for safety reasons. So when often this happens maybe during the summer months, and then come winter they want to use their gas, so when they go to try and ask us to come out and uncap the gas, we then need to help them speak to their supplier to have the debt basically cleared so as it goes to the back of the meter so as they can repay it going forward. So we will support tenants to, they can leave it, and some people go for years without having access to their gas because of it being capped. But the problem with the standing charges is it continues to accrue all through the summer months. So even when they come to October, November, they have the original debt plus whatever debt's accrued over the summer months as well. So it can be a really difficult situation for residents to start getting access to heating.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Cole.
So self-disconnection is a really, really awful description because people don't choose to self-disconnect.
No.
It's just something which happens when people run out of money with a prepayment meter, and the meter goes from working to switching off until people next top it up again. But it's terrible language used by the energy industry, and I think we need a better word to describe it. So we talked at the very beginning about what drives fuel poverty. One of the drivers is household income. And during the COVID period, lots of people were furloughed, but furlough payments didn't always necessarily cover the whole element of household income which people were used to. And so if people didn't receive a full furlough payment equal to what their previous salary was, that kind of resulted in more people needing help, especially when people have a prepayment meter, they're more likely to be on a low income. And so they probably didn't really have a great deal of discretionary spend. It was all essential spend. And so receiving a furlough payment of 80% of your household income meant that you were suddenly eating into your household energy. Eating into your household budget. And that caused a really progressive issue. And if I look at some of the stats for people who fuel bank support, so we support people in fuel crisis with prepayment meters, in financial years, the year ending, actually just when COVID was about to start, we supported 4,000 people in Scotland. The first year of COVID, so 2021, 20,000 people in Scotland who were self-disconnecting. The second year of COVID, 40,000 people, and that number has continued to go upwards post-COVID. My colleague Ros, she mentioned around people who have a critical dependency on energy. We track that post-support. We stubbornly see around between 40 and 43% of people whose meters we're topping up to get them back on supply again. So between 40 and 43% are very young, very old, very poorly, very cold. You know, they're people with absolute critical dependency on energy. It's probably people who probably don't look like us in this room here today, actually. It's people who are really struggling with energy. And then I think just something to add, and I think this is really interesting about COVID in particular. People were using more energy because they were at home, because they were studying at home, working at home, all those kind of things. But also, do you remember the messaging around making sure homes are really well ventilated? If somebody's got COVID in your home, you open the windows, make sure there's fresh air. And so that came through in our research, actually, anecdotally, that we were asking people to try and be really environmentally sensible, but also please open your windows, because you need to make sure homes are really well ventilated. And so that in itself actually drove increased energy costs during the COVID period.
So potentially contradictory messaging.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think is what you're saying there.
Yeah. But probably sensible as well at the time.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And may I just correct a figure Mr. Clark gave? Is that
okay?
Of course,
yeah.
So I think Ofgem, so the industry regulator for energy for GB, they released some stats in November that there's £3.8 billion of energy debt, but that's across the GB market, not just in Scotland.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a GB figure. Okay, so it's not just Scotland.
Thank you. And Before we move off this topic, I just wanted to come to you, Ms. Kane, briefly, because the inquiry is obviously interested in impacts at this stage, but also disproportionate impacts. And I noted in your statement, I think at paragraphs 22 and 23, you refer to rural communities.
Yeah.
Could I just ask you to elaborate on the impact during the pandemic on those, please?
Certainly. We've been talking so far about people who have access to mains gas and electricity. Obviously, in rural communities, there's a great many places that will only have access to electricity and haven't got gas or electric heating. Traditionally, have always used things like solid fuel, wood, gas and oil. During the pandemic, obviously, the same issues around household income will apply, but costs obviously escalated. And what we'd identified very early on was that there was just as likely to be a struggle in homes who were struggling to pay for energy in rural communities where the cost of the essential energy is high, but the bigger impact is you have to pay for it all up front. So if you want a delivery of oil, for example, which pre-pandemic would have been around sort of £300-400 for a tank of oil, went to over £1,000. I mean, £300-400 is a lot, but £1,000 is a huge difference. Same with all other solid fuels. And again, there's even less visibility and less help available for that. We did introduce, as part of the help, we did support for communities like that. But again, in traditional areas with traditional homes with the same issues of fuel poverty, poor insulation and so on, all exactly the same drivers have an even bigger impact on people who have to buy in bulk.
Thank you. Is there anything else anybody wishes to add on disproportionate impacts, or we'll move on? Okay. Thank you. I then want to turn to the third of the headings that I outlined at the beginning, and that's the key issues and impacts experienced by your own organisations and staff during the pandemic. For example, this might be an increase in demand in your services, the ways in which your services had to adapt during the pandemic given the restrictions that were in place, the roles your respective organisations played in the delivery of welfare assistance, impacts upon your staff, any issues that you may or may not have experienced with guidance in terms of frequency or clarity or otherwise, key worker status, or indeed any other key impacts that you wish to identify that impacted upon your organisations and staff. For this, could I ask Ms. White if you would start the discussion? Thank you.
So at the start of the pandemic, like everybody, everybody was at home. We had to adapt like everybody else without the equipment and the ways to deal with that. But we very quickly managed to have phones, access to our systems. So from the beginning, it was really all hands on deck to support our tenants, because a number of people, so before the UK government announced the support through furlough, we were receiving hundreds of calls from residents who were absolutely panicking about how they were going to manage. They were being told to go home, and a lot of them wouldn't have work. So at the beginning, it was about giving them advice about universal credit, what they could claim, what help they could receive, and we adapted our service. So specifically the Welfare Rights Service, we had to change from a face-to-face service to a fully telephone-based service, which I have to say was done admirably, and we managed to support hundreds of our residents to claim over the phone. That was really difficult because a lot of people didn't have the digital skills that you need to make those claims, and obviously organisations like the DWP were dealing with their own issues of trying to get their workforce mobilised remotely. So we had a huge learning curve at the start to do that, to help people with any kind of queries that they had. as a housing association, we still have specific roles that we have to carry out, like emergency repairs, so it was adapting to things like that very quickly. And throughout the pandemic, we adapted and changed how we provided services. We had to work really hard with other organisations to find out what help was out there and available. So if you can imagine, some people suddenly had no income, so they had no money for food, no money to top up. So what was available in the city centre to help that? One of the positives is that organisations work together and put their own funds a lot of the time. We did get funding gradually throughout the pandemic, but use their own funds and their own staff resources to deliver food parcels, to provide help to residents in the area. But we spent a lot of time finding out what was there, so signposting to other local voluntary organisations often. It was quite difficult with, again, councils had to very quickly adapt, so they were trying to find ways to work with their staff, but that would have been normally the direction where you would rely on the council to provide help, but they maybe took a bit of time to get their resources up to speed in terms of staff and being at home. Our roles changed a lot because we became not just maybe a welfare rights advisor. We had to deal with really emotionally difficult telephone calls where people were in real panic about how they were going to pay for, you know, absolute essentials for them and their families. People were worried about their health. They maybe had family support to things like collect prescriptions and attend support. They would have support workers coming in. Obviously, a lot of that still carried on, any essential services, but a huge part of their network just disappeared. So we had residents who were struggling with their own social isolation and the impact on their mental well-being, but in turn that has a huge impact on staff dealing with that. So they were listening to call after call of, you know, real stress and difficult conversations where sometimes it was telling people the maximum income that they could actually get through benefits, and so that was really upsetting for people that did not realise that this is the kinds of money they would be expected to live on. But in amongst all that, there was homeschooling for both staff and residents. There were people who were unwell, so there was a whole multitude of issues going on that we did everything we could to support, along with our partners and other organisations. As I said, this did have an impact on our staff, but we have caretakers who were out and about doing food parcels. We have support staff in our wellbeing teams who, again, were doing everything they could to support, so going above and beyond, as you would imagine they would do. Throughout the COVID pandemic, guidance changed sometimes on a weekly basis, so it was quite difficult to keep up with that, to make sure we were following the rules. So one of our health and safety coordinator, it was almost a full-time job adapting what could and couldn't happen, which members of staff could go out to a repair or who could be in the vans together, etc. So it was quite a tricky balancing act to work out what we could and couldn't do and when we could and couldn't do that. So I suppose ours is just a small microcosm of how it was throughout for all organisations. Our staff were frontline staff, but there was limits on how many could, you know, go out to properties, and that gradually changed over time. But tenancy sign-ups, for example, couldn't happen for a period of time, but when they did, it was how do we do that and remotely, and finding ways to adapt to that.
Thank you. You mentioned going above and beyond, and I think food parcels and being distributed, things. So was that funded work, to be clear, or not?
We did get some funding, yeah, through the Scottish Government, through the local council. Some of it was our own funding, excuse me. Some of it was our own resources. And a lot of it was working with other organisations, the local food banks, the local pantry that we have, and funding that we had through Fuel Bank, etc. So yeah, we've had funding and our own resources as well.
Thank you. And can I also ask you, before I give Mr Clark an opportunity to speak, about the presence of statutory services and energy suppliers during that time? Were they available to support the people that you support?
Yeah, it was, as I said, it was tricky for everybody to adapt. And some organisations, so for example, we had phones already, individual staff had phones, but I know that other organisations like councils, the DWP, there wouldn't be the need for them to have phones previously, so even sourcing IT equipment was a huge issue for lots of organisations. So a lot of services went to email only, so it was tricky to telephone organisations. So I guess we are very, very accessible as a very local housing association. So often that would be the first port of call if they couldn't get through to departments. So that could be suppliers, the DWP. There was a huge number of calls being made to these organisations, so even when they were able to take these calls, they were overwhelmed and they just didn't have the staff at the beginning to cope with the demand, particularly councils and the DWP. We were able to take those calls very quickly, so I think in the beginning, a lot of the work was possibly not for us, and we were able to support people and signpost them to go elsewhere. But yeah, it was difficult to get through on the phones, and to be quite honest, I think that's continued. I think there's a bit of a reluctance for telephone-based contact for a lot of organisations. Some of it has improved, I would say. For some organisations, there's as people have been forced into being more online and contacting digitally, then it has improved services so that there's more of a mix. So it's a bit of a, there's some positives and some negatives, but it is, some people just want to be able to pick up the phone and contact, and that definitely was an issue at the beginning.
Thank you. Mr Clark, can I ask you to speak about the impact on your own organisation and staff during that time, please?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Yeah, I mean, the biggest impact straight away was that increase in demand, and also the job role changing. That, you then had to become an expert in Teams or Zoom, and then it was harder to reach the most vulnerable because they maybe didn't have that, digital availability. But we lost staff at the very start, quite simply because they couldn't cope with the workload. We had to all of a sudden become caseload experts overnight, because our guys went from averaging maybe 50 cases, on average, and that would constantly replenish, as we dealt with or helped people, to over 150 caseloads. And you were getting people phoning, obviously they're in their house, so they were phoning every day, and we had staff leave. Quite simply, I mean, there's a bigger issue in relation to how we are sustained as an organisation. I mean, our frontline advice services, we rely on funding coming from Scottish Government, from Energy Redress, and usually it's short-term funding. So at times it's hard enough to bring in staff who then, have maybe only got funding for a year. And then as you get to the 7th or 8th month, they're starting to look for another job because there's no guarantee of funding elsewhere. So we lost staff pretty quickly. We had to shut, so we work across North Ayrshire, East Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway. We had to shut down North Ayrshire referrals, which was mad. These people are really relying on our service, but we couldn't. We didn't have the staff to cope with that. So we quickly had to try and recruit. So we had to be innovative and try and recruit people as quickly as we possibly could, and kind of give them, a bit of a promise that we're confident because of the current crisis we will get more funding. So please come on board, that was really tough, and to get the calibre of people that you need to be able to perform that role, working, as I say, with the most vulnerable in society at times. You need someone that has the right aptitude for that and the right communication skills. So it was a very, very tough time that we lost lots of staff during that. And as I say, we had to become caseload managers. And as opposed to us doing lots and lots of home visits, our telephone work massively increased as well. which again, when you've got a funder and you've promised them they're going to do a certain amount of home visits during the funding period, and they say, well, why? And you go, well, because the playing field changed. You know, in order to speak to 10 people, we had to do it over the phone rather than go out in one visit. You know, so we had to think and work smarter in being able to perform a service. You know, but it was a massive impact on staff.
Thank you. Mr. Cole.
Thank you. So we've spoken, lots of people have talked today about an increase in demand, but Fuel Bank doesn't really have a public profile, so we don't want members, or don't typically expect members of the public to find out Fuel Bank. And that was a conscious choice we made, that when we set Fuel Bank up, we were so conscious that there were amazing organisations across the UK who were doing really great things, but the barrier to their success was often energy or lack of energy in a household. So if you're trying to have a conversation at a local level about income maximisation or the importance of going to a GP for a clinic service or whatever, it's really hard to have that conversation if somebody's living in a house without energy, because at that moment they're in crisis. So Fuel Bank was about trying to solve that problem. We didn't want to create new advice services in the community. We wanted to offer Fuel Bank services to people who were already doing great things. And so we saw an increase in demand, and that really was more people coming to us saying, can I join your Fuel Bank network, because our clients are now living without energy, or energy is a barrier to the services we're trying to deliver. We're largely technology based. We have partners who are quality partners in the community, and we saw a huge, almost as like a tap being turned on, a deluge of people wanting to partner with us very quickly because they were seeing acute need in the community. And so we run generic onboarding sessions. Anybody who's interested about Fuel Bank, come and listen to what we do and see whether you meet our quality criteria and join our network. We in the height of the pandemic, we were running sort of 8 to 9 of these onboarding sessions a month. You know, we were really inundated, and we had to ramp up and bring more staff into our team to be able to facilitate all of that. And that was people helping on board, but also completing the quality and the assessment checks behind the scenes at our end. So when a referral is made to us, we need to make sure that people are in acute crisis. One of the things that we're also really conscious of is that we don't want to just be reactive, and so we were all really nice people, but we didn't want people to come into Fuel Bank if we could avoid it. So we proactively worked with the energy sector, say, look, what can the energy sector do differently to stop people needing to need Fuel Bank help in the first place? The big issue we saw was there's a button on a meter you can press, the prepaid meter. It's called an emergency credit. If you run out of money, you press the button. I'm sorry, I'm talking with my hands. You press the button, and it gives you £5 of extra energy. Now, £5 doesn't go very far, and we saw that that was the key driver of people needing our help. So we worked with the energy sector and the Energy Trade Association in GB to increase the amount of emergency credit, and we increased that to £50, which actually meant that if people were in crisis, they didn't have energy in their home, they could press that button, at least they'd maybe get about a week's worth of energy, which we thought was really important because it gave everybody in that support network more time to try and do some of the heavy lifting and unpicking to kind of put more robust solutions in place. So we tried to kind of respond both reactively to need, but also proactively to stop people needing our help or needing our partners' help, because we could see that things were very, very fraught, especially in the first months of COVID.
You talked about people joining your network. Do you have numbers as to what your partners were kind of pre-pandemic and what the result of that was, given what was happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So pre-pandemic in Scotland, we had, if I'm really, really honest, 6 or 7 partners, but some of those were lapsed and not really doing a great deal with us. You know, if you look in Scotland now, you know, we've got over 200 partners, and that growth was during that COVID period.
Thank you. Ms. Kane.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that growth was facilitated by Scottish Government funding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because obviously working through lots of local partner organisations, the cost of providing this sort of support was beyond even the normal budgets. You know, a lot of organisations were sort of charity-based, little local community-based. It was Scottish Government funding that completely enabled that expansion and provided the funding that we were able to provide onwards through our partner organisations directly to their clients to help manage the fuel crisis issues that they were facing and buy time for the solutions these guys were putting in place with their clients to actually bear fruit.
Thank you. Well, we're going to move to funding next anyway, so you kicked off that conversation, which is absolutely fine. But yes, we'll just go to that now. And since you've touched on it, Ms. Kane, I wanted to ask next the panel just about the, I suppose, the adequacy of the funding that was available during the pandemic, whether in the delivery of your welfare assistance programmes or indeed to keep your organisations running in terms of staffing and operations, and also whether that funding, in your view, was perhaps sufficiently targeted during the pandemic also to help those that you support, and also the funding landscape as it is now. I'd like to ask you about that also. Ms Kane, you started the conversation, I think, so we'll go to Ms White next, and then Mr Clark, and then Mr Cole, if that works.
Okay.
Ms White.
Do you want to say more?
No, you can.
You can always say, we'll go around, and if you've got more, we can come back.
I guess the funding, there was a lot of funding, but it still wasn't enough. So there was a lot of funding for fuel vouchers, for actual fuel debt. There was funding for energy advisors. So the Scottish Government, the support that the UK Government that gave for the coronavirus staff retention scheme, all of these things contributed to keeping people in jobs, keeping people predominantly able to pay their rent, to pay their bills, but it still wasn't enough because people still were struggling, they still had higher costs, and as we know throughout COVID and after, the costs have just absolutely rocketed. So although there was a lot of funding around, and we were fortunate to be able to have funding for an energy advisor, it isn't enough to mitigate the extra costs, and we are seeing the after effects of that now, where people who maybe had debt previously and either had some help with that, or organisations either by choice or because they had to do it by legal ways, they had to they weren't recovering it in the same ways during the pandemic and the aftermath. But all that's done really is delayed the recovery of the debt. So we have a lot of people who were in debt for their energy, which has gradually increased. They did have some support through the pandemic and through the worst of the increases in energy costs, but they are still in huge amount of debt, and we can see the funding tapering off now, so it's going to have a huge knock-on effect where people are still struggling to pay for things. The increase in inflation and the energy costs, they haven't gone down, nothing's decreased, it's just not increasing as high, so we are seeing a huge knock-on effect of that now, and there's not really the funding available through some of the energy suppliers have funding that you can apply to, but it's not for all, it doesn't work for everybody, and it's not necessarily going to support everybody that needs the help. We did have other home heating fund that was a huge help, that's no longer available, so there are funds that were available that aren't anymore, but the need is still there.
Thank you. Mr Clark.
Yeah, I mean, I think the home heating fund, fuel insecurity fund, came after the pandemic, was that correct?
Yeah.
So that was as a result. The crux of the crisis is the increasing in energy debt. The funds that have been given have been great, but they've been a bit of a sticking plaster. They've kind of helped people stay on supply for a period of time, but they've not dealt with the issue. And the issue is that debt sitting on the meter, right? And people with energy prices, more than doubling, people don't have that opportunity to bring that debt down the way, okay? And that just continues. In relation to funding, we've always, as an organisation, so I can only speak for our organisation and our thoughts on funding. So since 2012, Lemonade has always had to apply for independent funding. So we've various funding sources, whether it be the big lottery or the European Social Fund, when the European Social Fund was kicking about, but by and large the Scottish Government. So since 2019, Lemonade has been funded partly through the Investing in Communities Fund from the Scottish Government and Energy Redress. So Energy Redress is a pot of money I think it's administered through the Energy Savings Trust. It's a kind of off-gem pot where energy suppliers are penalised for doing wrong things, and that pot's then available for organisations to apply for. We've always applied in the premise that for us, core staffing costs to provide energy advice to people will create a greater impact than just an amount of money to pay down a fuel debt. Yeah? So for me, each staff member that I have, again, just to put it into easy figures, for every £30,000 of salary, our staff will reduce fuel debt by £150,000. So, you know, that kind of return on investment is massive. Where if that funding was just giving us £30,000 to pay down fuel debt, that's all it'll do, is pay down fuel debt. So the funding side of things has always been a big issue for us, right? And trying to get across that in order to alleviate fuel poverty, you need to have frontline energy advisors that deal with the individual problems. There's lots of funding, and there has continued to be lots of funding. For me, although it's very important, but disproportionately fabric first funding. There's much more funding available in order to make a house more energy efficient than there is for providing frontline energy advice. But again, the thing that we keep getting across is that the energy market as it is just now, price determines people being in fuel poverty or not, or certainly massively contributes towards it. The price that's set in the energy market is a demand and supply market run by private sector energy suppliers. If do-gooders come along and make every house as energy efficient as it's ever going to be, energy suppliers will still increase prices because they're allowed to. It's not regulated as tightly or government controlled as it should be, but they'll just keep increasing prices because it's demand and supply. You know, it's a commodity price as far as they're concerned. So that, you know, for us, the kind of disproportionate amount of funding, it's very important to get to net zero. Extremely important. But for us, that amalgamation of net zero funding and fuel poverty funding, we think is a misnomer. We see it happening now where, you know, there's lots of funding for things like the installation of electric heating systems. Air source heat pump is quoted often. But the reality is there are various organisations installing air source heat pumps. An air source heat pump relies on electricity to, you know, electricity unit price just now on average is 25 pence a kilowatt. Gas, which has potentially been removed from the property to install the air source heat pump, is about 5 pence a kilowatt. Now it's deemed that an air source heat pump will be more efficient than a gas boiler. But even the Air Source Heat Pump Association of the UK say that, you know, it's never going to get anywhere near the efficiency to make up for that five times of a differential in price. So that, from a funding perspective, that's a big issue for us. And the fuel poverty strategy of UK and Scottish Government continues to focus on a fabric first approach. It continues to focus on fuel poverty linked to carbon reduction. And that needs to change in order to be able to deal with the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Cole.
Thank you. I think, to be really honest, actually, if I go back before COVID, as a charity, when we'd apply for funding, you kind of fill in an application form and then you could kind of go on a round-the-world cruise because it would take that long for the response to come back. And I think, to be fair, the Scottish Government were really quick at turning around decisions. It felt that there was a process that people went through to assess whether we had the capability, and they were quick at kind of releasing approval to go live with the project, then releasing funding for the project to happen. And I'll be really honest, within Scotland, any partner who came to us during the COVID period asking whether they could become part of Fuel Bank, we never turned. We did turn people away when they didn't meet our quality criteria, but if they met our quality criteria, we didn't reject any partner in Scotland from joining our network. And that wasn't the case in England and in Wales, when at the same time we didn't have the same level of support as we did from the Scottish Government. The issue still exists today. Situations are much worse, driven more by the fallout from COVID, where I think a lot of people who are on low income, their resilience was eroded. So when the energy crisis started and things became even more expensive, there was no resilience to fall back on. The emergency £10 note in the back of a kitchen cupboard in a jam jar, that was long gone, it had been spent. I think that for our base, people who come to Fuel Banks, we're not seeing debt being something which goes through everybody we help. There isn't a debt issue with everybody. It's a poverty issue. There are people who are not in debt. They're managing life by just living without energy, and sometimes there are too many days left at the end of the month. So not everybody who comes to Fuel Bank is a debtor. And if I look at, the question you asked me, Mr. Stephen, was how are things today? If I look at last winter, and this is a figure for our network across the UK, the week before Christmas last year, we were spending about £1 million a week in topping up people's meters across the UK. And this winter, when it's peak winter, we'll be spending about the same amount at the moment. There is a real level of poverty and inequality across the UK as a whole, and then in Scotland, we over-index in Scotland in terms of needs. So about a third of the people who Fuel Bank supports are in Scotland, and that's just because of the high levels of fuel poverty here. And Paul made some really good points around this focus on long-term fabric first. That is a really, really live issue, that there should be no need to compete, really, that making a home energy efficient or installing net zero measures such as air source heat pumps, yes, they could be the right solution, but those things take time. And when you're looking at those long-term strategic solutions, you also need to be providing short-term crisis help for people who are in crisis in that moment. And it's a bit like if you fall off your motorbike and you break your leg and you go to A&E, yes, you might need somebody to mend your leg and put it in a plaster cast, but you also need somebody to stop the flow of blood. And both those things are the right thing. You need crisis intervention to work alongside long-term preventative measures. They shouldn't compete with each other, and sometimes it feels that they do compete, and the funding often goes to focus on long-term strategic interventions. And I really struggle as leading a charity when sometimes quite frequently actually, but not in Scotland, we say to partners, I'm really sorry we can't support your clients because we do not have the money to deliver crisis support in your locality, but there is funding for longer term fuel poverty intervention. And I think that balance is maybe slightly adrift in places.
Thank you. Ms Keane, having heard everybody else speak, is there anything you wish to add? Or?
The only thing I'd wish to add is that if you look at this from an individual perspective, that developing that understanding of the range of cause and effect is key on getting the balance between all these various issues, because everything is valid. Different organisations say, well, this is important, but the reality is that you need to understand the balance and almost the order of activity, because if you haven't got energy today, it doesn't matter that in 2 months' time somebody's going to come and insulate your home, but you still need your home to insulate, because that will contribute to the long-term solution, but it won't be the whole answer. And I think all of us tend to think in single issue to solve the problem, but it's a whole complex interrelation of things that need to happen in order to eventually get to the point where we're no longer sitting here talking fuel crisis, where Paul's not having to worry about the proper insulation of homes or getting the balance right. And that's the real challenge that faces all of us going forward.
Thank you. That takes us then, I think, fifth and finally to lessons learned. I said at the beginning I'd give you all an opportunity, and this is that opportunity for suggestions as to what you think the Scottish Government perhaps could do to mitigate either ongoing impacts of the pandemic, or could do differently to improve matters in the event of another pandemic if we find ourselves there again, or a similar event. And I think we've probably touched on some of these already, but I want to give you that opportunity. So, Mr Clark, could I start with you, and then we'll work our way along the line, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I think just the theme that I was saying earlier on, the fuel poverty strategy needs to be looked at, not just in case there's another pandemic, but just because if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll continue to get what you've always got. And fuel poverty is, there's been lots of money invested in the kind of fabric first priority, but it's not made any impact on fuel poverty whilst the market is the way it is. I mean, the energy market, if governments could do anything, this was my wish list, right? They need to control the market better, and not just the retail energy suppliers, because that's the focus a lot of the time, is the retail suppliers, the generators. I mean, the issue, the massive issue in the UK is the simple fact that the wholesale price of energy in the UK is determined by the highest cost of generation. So the highest cost of generation in the UK is gas generation. It doesn't matter whether it's generated through turbines or tidal, the wholesale cost is set by that highest cost of generation. And that wholesale cost is about 42% of everybody's energy bills. That's the starting point for me. You change that, you change the whole market completely. You know, retail energy suppliers, there are restrictions on what they can attain as profit. There's not necessarily restrictions on what they can class as costs and overheads, you know, but that needs to be leveraged. For fuel poverty to be alleviated, there needs to be concentration on energy prices and what's fair and reasonable in the UK. The wholesale price of energy, and I'll track it daily, the wholesale cost of gas just now is only about 20% more expensive today than it was in April 2021. And yet, the cost of gas retail is more than double what it was in April 2021. And that wholesale price of gas in the UK for the last year has been fairly consistent. That just needs stronger government. So that's my wish list going forward of how to alleviate fuel poverty, and how, if there ever a pandemic comes along again, you know, that's the important areas to levy.
Thank you. Ms White.
The cost of energy is obviously a huge issue, but people's income, minimum income, is really important. So what was found during the pandemic are particularly people that weren't in receipt of benefits or hadn't claimed before and did claim. So I would say it's one of the positives that people have more empathy and understanding for those in receipt of benefits, whether it's because they've lost their job or they have health issues or they're a carer, whatever the reason they're in receipt of benefits. I think a huge proportion of the population also ended up in that situation, and so they have more understanding of how difficult it is to live on such a low income and how that impacts their ability to heat their homes. I think some of the other things, some positives, partnership working, people working together to just deal with things and get it done really quickly, mobilising quickly. I think we've got systems in place now, and I would really hope that we don't let those slip. So technology is a huge positive, but we need to keep up with technology. So when things need replaced, for example, that, you know, schools, education, all businesses keep abreast of that, so that we're all able to continue to do these things remotely if we have to. More understanding around the difficulties people have with digital inclusion. It's not just possible to hand out, I don't know, a laptop or a tablet and expect people to just be able to suddenly be able to do things at home, teach their children, be able to adapt to doing things online that they've never done before. So those kinds of things, but also language issues. We have a high proportion of people who don't speak English as their first language, and so very quickly you're, one, not reaching those people because they can't understand the communications, and two, they often need help to do basic, you know, and I'm coming from a benefits and fuel poverty, but even just doing a top up, they maybe had somebody to help them do things like that, suddenly they're having to do it online. So an understanding of the difficulties people have in being able to adapt quickly. I also wanted to touch on private renters. Social housing have the ability to reach huge amounts of the population just by our ethos, the way we communicate with our residents, but there's a large proportion of the population out there who maybe have a landlord who own one or two or just smaller groups of properties, and I think private renters potentially don't have access or are not aware of the same level of help that could be available to them. So that's maybe something that needs to be considered, how you reach those groups of people. And income. I'll come back to income and how low income impacts people's ability to make choices about what they spend their income on. And having your home, you know, a few weeks ago it was extremely cold at a time of year that we don't expect it, and very suddenly we are bombarded with contacts, people needing help, and those on prepayment meters often don't have debt because they are paying in advance, but they do have that issue where they genuinely have to choose between eating and turning their heating on. So they might put it on for an hour a day, and the impact on your health, your well-being, your just being able to get through the day where you're cold all day is just unbearable. So that's what I would like to be considered going forward.
Thank you. Ms Keane.
I think that one of the key lessons that can be learned is what worked well. And I think it's really important to capture what worked well to support people so that there's a model in place should it happen again. I think we've touched on a number of interesting issues in this last part, and I think I'd particularly like to focus on private renters, because there are parts of the energy market that are entirely overlooked from a regulatory perspective. So you could be a private renter, the energy account is still in your name, and you might have to prepay for it, but it's in your name. There are subsets of rentals where the energy account's the landlord's name, and there are sub-meters in place. The landlord can do what they like. It's searching out some of these little niche markets where people are completely overlooked, and people are much more vulnerable in the situation where they haven't got that protection of regulation. So I think for me it's twofold. It's really make sure that the lessons learned from this time are captured, and almost there is a plan a campaign should it happen again. Because if we found ourselves in this situation where we're all shut up at home again, the impacts are going to be the same. It's about alleviating them more quickly, lessening what those impacts are, and having a plan in place to do that. And then it's sort of looking at where are the situations that sit outside the majority, and they will be there. Obviously private landlords is one, off-grid is another. It's looking at what needs to be done to protect those people that potentially fall out of the 90% of the norm, as it were.
Thank you.
And there's more work to be done on that.
And last but not least, Mr Cole.
Thank you. I think during COVID we showed that the wider we could move at pace, and it's really important that we don't lose sight of that, and that's what we absolutely ensure is there forever. But if this issue ever happens again, we absolutely ensure we do move at pace. And it's not about taking shortcuts, it's not about jettisoning things which were important, it's about making strategic decisions and acting on them really, really quickly, and also looking at maybe whether decisions have been made which kind of added complexity but didn't actually add any value to process. So an example of Fuel Bank is that we don't kind of check DWP data, and we don't check Register Scotland data when we're supporting people, but we have lots of checks and balances in place to make sure we're getting help to people who are living without energy, and we're helping people same day. So 99% of people who need help today and are helped today were only identified to us this morning. And we check how effective we are. Are we hitting the right quality levels? And we're achieving consistently 98, 99% quality. So we're getting help to people really quickly. You can deliver at pace and deliver really great outcomes for people. By working at pace, it doesn't mean you're sacrificing things. I think from a fuel poverty perspective, it's really complex, I think, because fuel poverty is devolved to Holyrood, but actually the levers are, some exist within Holyrood and some very clearly exist within Westminster and Whitehall. And that makes it really, really complex, I think. I think for me there are three things to think about really. Firstly, making sure that homes are energy efficient, so arc leaking energy is so critical. But there will be people who, for whatever reason, aren't able to heat their home because maybe they're on a low income, or maybe because they have higher energy needs because of health, or maybe because their homes are really leaky, or maybe because of all three of those. And that's where we need some degree of support. At the moment, average energy bills in the UK is £1,700. The Warm Home Discount provides support to low-income households. It's £150, which doesn't really touch the sides for somebody who's got an average energy bill of £1,700. So we need a social tariff. That's something which the UK government needs to lead on. But the Scottish Government and Scottish parliamentarians have kind of got to ensure that Scottish voice is absolutely heard within Westminster. And then there'll be people who do get a social tariff or do get support and do live in an energy efficient home but still need crisis help. There'll be people who just, for whatever reason, the support which isn't there, and that crisis help must always be there. And I think it's those three areas of decent quality home plus a social tariff for those people who need help kind of closing that fuel poverty gap, plus crisis help for people who are falling through the cracks. It's those three things together which need to be considered. It's really important.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for this panel, subject to anything that you wish to ask or add.
No, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stephen. No, all that remains for me to do is thank the panellists for their participation this afternoon, and that brings an end to today's proceedings. We're not sitting tomorrow, and we resume again at 11:15 on Thursday. That's Thursday the 12th, Thursday morning. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.